Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's story. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's story. Now, let's go back to Mark as he steps into this strange new world. The next morning, Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the offer Eleanor had made. His mother, looking tired as ever, sipped her coffee across from him, waiting for him to speak. He hadn't told her everything yet, the part about the marriage, the arrangement. But now, he had to make a choice, and he was starting to see that this might be the only way to save his family. He took a deep breath and finally looked up. "Mom, I'm going to take the offer." His mother looked at him, a mix of concern and resignation in her eyes. "You're really going to marry a woman you don't even know? Just to save us?" Her voice cracked, and he could see the pain in her expression. Mark knew she wasn't asking because she didn't understand, but because she was worried about what he might have to give up. "I don't want to do this, but I have to. For you, for us. This is the only way we're going to make it out of this mess. She's offering to clear the debts. She's offering me a future." His mother looked at him for a long moment before setting her cup down with a sigh. "If this is what it takes to save us, then you'll have my blessing. But don't lose yourself in it, Mark. Don't lose who you are." Mark nodded. He knew his mother didn't want him to give up his dignity or his future for a business deal, but the weight of their situation pressed on him too much. "I won't, Mom, I promise." That afternoon, Mark returned to the bistro, the place where everything had changed. Eleanor was already waiting for him, sitting at a table near the window. Her calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was a hint of something softer in her eyes as he approached. "You've made your decision," she said, standing to greet him. Mark nodded. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll marry you." Eleanor smiled faintly, a look of relief crossing her face. "Good. We can begin the paperwork right away." Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure how to ask the next question. "What does this mean for me? What happens next?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "It means you'll be my husband, but you won't be expected to act like one. This is strictly a business arrangement." She walked around the table and sat down. "You'll help me in the public eye, and I'll help you with your debts, your future. There will be no romantic expectations. But that doesn't mean you're not important to me." Mark was taken aback by her sincerity. Despite the cold, businesslike nature of the deal, there was something human behind her words. He still wasn't sure what that meant for him, but he felt a strange sense of obligation and unspoken promise to try and make it work. "And the family? Will I have to deal with them?" he asked, his voice a little tense. Eleanor's smile was knowing. "I don't have any children, and my family's business is what I care about. But you'll need to attend family events, weddings, galas, those sorts of things. We'll maintain a public image of a happy couple. Think of it as a partnership, Mark." Mark took a deep breath. It sounded easy enough, but he knew it wouldn't be. There would be moments where the pressure would build, and he wasn't sure if he would be able to handle it. But he had made his decision. And as he signed the paperwork later that day, he realized that his life was about to change forever. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one he never expected, but one he had no choice but to embrace. Weeks passed, and Mark slowly adapted to his new life with Eleanor. The initial shock of the arrangement wore off, and he found himself living in the world of luxury and power that he had only ever dreamed of. Eleanor kept her word. There were no romantic expectations, no pressure to act like a husband in the traditional sense, but Mark quickly realized that living in her world wasn't as simple as he had hoped. He was invited to gala events, family gatherings, and business meetings, all of which required him to play the part of the perfect husband. His first few appearances were awkward, and he could feel the eyes of the other guests on him, questioning his place in this high society. Eleanor, however, was a master at navigating these events. She moved through the crowd with ease, charming everyone with her sharp wit and calm confidence. Mark, on the other hand, struggled to fit in. He was constantly reminded of how different their worlds were: his humble beginnings, the debt hanging over his head, and now this facade of wealth and power. Yet, through all the surface-level interactions, he couldn't deny the growing respect he had for Eleanor. She was strong, intelligent, and seemingly unbothered by the superficial nature of the life they were leading. Still, there were moments when he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The distance between them was more than just a physical, it was emotional, too. Eleanor never pushed him, never asked for more than what was agreed upon, but he could tell there was something more beneath the surface. One evening, after a particularly long day of business meetings and social events, Mark found himself alone in their shared home. He was sitting in the study, looking out over the city skyline, when Eleanor entered. She was dressed casually for once, her sharp suit replaced with a simple blouse and jeans. There was a softness to her, a vulnerability that Mark hadn't seen before. "You're still here," she said with a slight smile, noticing him in the study. Mark looked up, a little surprised. "Yeah, just thinking about things." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Eleanor walked over and stood by the window, gazing out at the city. "You know," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I never imagined my life would turn out this way. I built my empire, I made my money, but sometimes it feels empty." Mark glanced at her, surprised by the confession. "I'm not saying this to make you feel sorry for me," she continued, her voice steady, "but it's easy to get lost in this world. All the power, the control, it doesn't fill the hole inside." There was a long pause. Mark wasn't sure how to respond. He was used to seeing Eleanor as a woman of steel, a figure of authority. But now, he saw a different side of Hera's side that was just as human as he was. He stood up slowly and walked over to her. "I get it," he said quietly. "I really do. This whole thing wasn't what I expected either." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Mark hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "I thought it would be all about money, about securing a future. But now I see it's more complicated than that. You're not just some business deal to me anymore, Eleanor." "I never thought I'd say that, but it's true." She stared at him for a moment, her gaze intense, then a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips. "You're not as bad at this as you think," she said, her tone light. Mark chuckled softly, but there was a weight to the moment. For the first time since their agreement, he felt like they were standing on equal ground. He wasn't just a man playing a role anymore. He had become part of something real, something deeper than just a contract. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a connection he hadn't expected. As the night wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this strange, unorthodox arrangement might lead them to something neither of them had planned for. The more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he saw the person behind the facade. And maybe, just maybe, this could turn into something more than he ever imagined. It had been a few months since Mark agreed to the arrangement with Eleanor, and things had started to settle into a strange but manageable rhythm. He had grown accustomed to attending high-profile events, living in a luxurious home, and pretending to be her husband for the public's sake. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged. Mark found himself wondering more and more about the woman behind the business deal. Eleanor was a mystery, strong, composed, and always in control. But every once in a while, when the world around them grew quiet, he saw cracks in her armor. It was on one of these quiet nights that he realized just how far things had come. After a long day of meetings, Eleanor and Mark sat together in the living room, the city skyline twinkling outside the window. She was reviewing some documents, her usual stern focus evident, but there was a softness in the way she spoke to him now. It was as though the walls had come down just enough for them to see each other as more than just business partners. You know, Eleanor said, breaking the silence, I used to think that building an empire would fix everything. That if I had enough power, enough money, I'd never have to feel vulnerable. Mark looked up from his own work, his gaze lingering on her. And what do you think now? He asked, his voice steady. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression distant. Now I think that no matter how much power you have, it's never enough if you don't have someone to share it with, she replied softly. Mark felt a shift in the air. This wasn't the Eleanor he had come to know, the woman who had always kept a cool distance. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to her, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. I didn't expect this arrangement to mean anything beyond the contract, he said, his voice low. But I don't know. I feel like there's more here than I thought. More than just business. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what he meant. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. I never wanted this to be just about business, Mark, she said quietly. I never thought I'd want more than just a convenient partnership. Mark's chest tightened. Was this what he thought it was? Was this a moment of honesty, or just another fleeting emotion? Do you want more? He asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor's expression softened. She stood up slowly, walking over to the window. I don't know, she said, her voice barely audible. I think I do, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. I've been running from emotions for so long, I'm afraid to face them. Mark could feel the weight of her words, the vulnerability she had just exposed. For the first time since their agreement, he saw Eleanor not as a powerful CEO or the woman he was supposed to pretend to love, but as someone who had lived through loss and fear just like him. I get it, he said quietly. I've been running from my own fears too. They stood there for a moment, both of them staring out the window at the city below, lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them had the answers, but somehow, they had come to a place where they could finally speak honestly with each other. Eleanor turned to him then, her expression open in a way that he had never seen before. Mark, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, maybe this wasn't the way I imagined it, but maybe we can figure this out together. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never imagined this would happen. But here they were, two people who had started as strangers, bound by a contract, now standing at the edge of something new. Something real. Yeah, he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Maybe we can. As the days went on, Mark and Eleanor found themselves navigating this delicate new phase of their arrangement. What had started as a business deal was slowly, almost imperceptibly, evolving into something more. The walls that had once kept them separate were gradually coming down, and for the first time, they both found themselves questioning the boundaries of their fake marriage. It was a strange feeling for Mark. He had come into this arrangement with one goal in mind: to get his family out of debt. But now, as he spent more time with Eleanor, he couldn't deny the connection that had begun to form between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper than mere obligation. Eleanor, too, seemed to be changing. Her once distant and professional demeanor had softened over time, revealing a side of her that Mark hadn't expected. She was still the powerful CEO, but now there were moments of vulnerability, moments when she let her guard down. One evening, after a particularly long day of business meetings and social events, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner at their favorite restaurant. The place was quiet, intimate, and the warm light of the candles flickered softly on the table between them. As they sat there, the conversation drifted from business to more personal topics. Mark noticed how relaxed she seemed, how different she looked without the weight of her usual armor. You know, Eleanor said, breaking the silence between them, I never imagined I'd find myself in this situation. I thought my life was planned out perfectly: successful career, business empire, the works. But now, I feel like I'm missing something. Mark looked at her curiously. What do you mean? He asked. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then shrugged, her smile faint but sincere. I thought success and power would be enough. But there's something about the way you've been with me, something real, even if we're just pretending. It's like I've been living a lie all these years. Mark sat back in his chair, surprised by her honesty. He had never expected to hear Eleanor speak like this. She wasn't just the confident CEO anymore, she was a woman, struggling with the same fears and uncertainties that anyone else might feel. I never thought I'd hear you say that, Mark replied softly. I thought you had it all figured out. Eleanor let out a small laugh, her eyes twinkling for the first time in what felt like forever. No one has it all figured out, Mark. Not even me. They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, Eleanor spoke again, this time with a quieter, more thoughtful tone. Maybe we've both been hiding from what we really want. Maybe we've both been pretending for too long. Mark met her gaze, feeling something stir inside of him. He had never expected to be sitting across from this woman, this powerful, intelligent, and yet deeply vulnerable woman, talking about their fears and desires. For a brief moment, he let himself wonder what it would be like if they didn't have to pretend anymore. What would it be like if their connection wasn't just based on a contract? Could there be something more? But before he could voice any of these thoughts, Eleanor spoke again, breaking his train of thought. Mark, she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't know where this is going, but I want to be honest with you. I never intended for this marriage to mean anything. But now, I'm not so sure. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to say. He had been living in the space between reality and pretense for so long, it was hard to know where one ended and the other began. But as he looked at Eleanor, sitting there with an openness he hadn't seen before, he knew one thing for certain: didn't want to keep pretending either. Maybe it's time for us to stop pretending, Mark said softly. Eleanor's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had entered this arrangement, they both saw the truth in each other's eyes. Maybe it is, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, Mark realized that this wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was something real. And it was only just beginning. It had been weeks since that conversation, and Mark and Eleanor had started to navigate the complex web of their evolving relationship. What had once been a business arrangement was slowly shifting, becoming something neither of them had anticipated. They had begun to spend more time together outside the world of high-profile events and meetings. Slowly but surely, the walls they had built around their hearts started to come down. Eleanor continued to maintain her role as the powerful CEO, the woman who had everything, but Mark noticed the subtle shifts. She was opening up more, allowing herself to be vulnerable in ways he hadn't expected. And with each passing day, Mark began to see Eleanor not just as the woman who had saved him from his financial troubles, but as someone he could care for, someone who had her own struggles and fears. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Eleanor invited Mark to join her at her private art gallery. It was a quiet space, away from the chaos of the world, filled with paintings and sculptures that reflected Eleanor's personal tastes and memories. As they walked through the gallery, Mark noticed how different Eleanor looked in this space. She seemed more at peace, as if the art was an extension of her soul, a part of her that no one else saw. You know, Mark said, breaking the silence, I never expected this from you. Eleanor turned to him, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? She asked. Mark glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on a few of the paintings. All this, it's not what I imagined when I first met you. You're not just a businesswoman. There's so much more to you. Eleanor's expression softened, and she gave him a small smile. I guess I've hidden that part of myself for a long time. Life has a way of making you put up walls, Mark. I built those walls to protect myself, to keep things controlled, but now I'm not so sure anymore. Mark looked at her, a sudden wave of understanding washing over him. He had seen her as an untouchable figure, someone who had everything under control, but now he saw a woman who had fought battles of her own, a woman who was learning to let go of her past and embrace something new. He stepped closer to her, his voice soft but steady. I think we're both learning that sometimes, we don't have to do everything alone. And sometimes, the walls we build are the things that keep us from what we really need. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if she were seeing him in a new light. I think you're right, she said quietly. Maybe it's time for me to let go of the past. To stop pretending that I have everything figured out. For a long moment, they stood there, in the center of the gallery, surrounded by art that spoke to them in ways words could not. In that moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. There were no contracts, no expectations, just the two of them, standing together in a space that felt like their own. Eleanor turned to him then, her voice low and sincere. Mark, I never thought this would happen. I never imagined that I'd find someone who would make me question everything I've believed in. But now, I'm not so sure if I want to go back to the way things were. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected this moment, this confession, but it felt real. He had spent so much time wondering if this was all just a business deal, but now, as he stood with Eleanor, he knew it was something more. I don't want to go back either, Mark said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed truly free. Maybe this wasn't the way I expected it to happen, she said, but I think we found something real here. Something that's worth fighting for. Mark nodded slowly, his heart full. He had come into this arrangement out of necessity, but now, he was beginning to see it for what it truly was. It wasn't just a contract, Anna Marie, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that neither of them could have predicted. As the evening drew to a close, they stood there, surrounded by the art that reflected their journey, both uncertain of what the future held but knowing one thing for sure: they were no longer pretending. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The following weeks felt like a blur for Mark and Eleanor. The changes in their relationship were palpable, and yet, both of them were still figuring out what it meant. They had moved beyond the walls of their initial arrangement, but neither was ready to confront the deeper truths about their feelings. Still, every time they spent together, whether it was a quiet evening at home or a public event, marked a deeper connection that neither of them had anticipated. They had moments of joy, of shared laughter, and even moments of silence where the world around them seemed to disappear. But, as always happens in life, reality was never far behind. Eleanor's family, particularly her distant relatives, began to notice that things were not as they seemed. Invitations to family gatherings became more frequent, and there was an increasing sense of scrutiny around their arrangement. Mark felt the weight of their eyes on him, and he could sense that they were all waiting for him to slip up. Eleanor, for her part, continued to stand by him. She shielded him from their probing questions and defended their partnership, but even she could feel the pressure mounting. It was at one such family gathering that the breaking point came. It was a lavish dinner held at her family estate, and the guests were a mix of powerful business partners, distant relatives, and old friends. The evening started out as it always did, polished, elegant, and filled with laughter, but as the night wore on, Mark began to sense the tension building. Her cousin, a sharp-tongued woman named Victoria, was the first to make a subtle comment. So, Mark, she began with a thin smile, how does it feel to be married to someone who practically built an empire from the ground up? Her tone was light, but the underlying judgment was clear. Eleanor, ever the poised hostess, quickly stepped in. Victoria, she said, her voice smooth, Mark has been an invaluable partner. You should know that. But Mark could see the way her eyes hardened when Victoria didn't back off. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew more uncomfortable, and soon, more guests began to voice their own concerns. They talked about Mark's background, his lack of business experience, and his sudden rise into this new world of wealth and privilege. Mark tried to stay calm, but he could feel his confidence slipping. He had been living this charade for so long, but tonight it was harder than ever to ignore the whispers. It was only when Eleanor stepped in again, this time more forcefully, that the conversation took a turn. Enough, she said, her voice commanding the room's attention. Mark may not have the business pedigree you think he should, but he has something none of you have: integrity. And that's more valuable than any empire. The room fell silent. Mark looked at her, surprised by the force of her words. Eleanor wasn't just defending him, she was asserting her own values, her own belief in what was truly important. The tension in the room shifted, and the conversation finally moved to something else. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had revealed something deeper. As they left the dinner that night, Eleanor's car quiet except for the soft hum of the engine, Mark turned to her. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice filled with both gratitude and something else he couldn't quite put his finger on. Eleanor glanced over at him, her face still set with a faint frown, but there was something softer in her eyes. "I did it because I believe in you, Mark," she said simply. "This arrangement started as a business deal, yes. But it's become more than that. You've shown me things about myself I didn't even know I needed to see. And that's worth protecting." Mark felt a surge of emotion, something between relief and disbelief. He had never imagined that he would find himself here, in this strange new life, and yet here he was, not only accepted by Eleanor but defended in front of her world. He had come into this relationship with nothing but debt and desperation, but now, he felt like he was part of something real. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor didn't respond at first. Instead, she reached over and took his hand, a simple gesture that meant more than words could convey. The moment felt significant, as if everything had changed in the space of a single gesture. As they drove through the quiet streets, Mark realized something that he had been trying to ignore for weeks. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It wasn't about protecting his family's future or fulfilling a contract. It was about them. About what they had built together, and, for the first time, Mark wondered if they were both ready to face the truth about the future, about themselves, and about what it meant to truly share their lives with someone else. As the days went by, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. What had started as a simple business arrangement had now grown into something much more complicated and much more real. Eleanor's words at the dinner, her defense of him, had stuck with Mark. He couldn't help but replay them in his mind. "He has integrity. That's more valuable than any empire." It wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration that spoke to something deep inside both of them. But while the emotional connection between them had deepened, they still faced the harsh realities of the world around them. Despite Eleanor's protective stance, her family continued to scrutinize their relationship. The pressure was mounting, and Mark could feel it in the way her relatives looked at him, in the way the business partners whispered behind closed doors. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about their public image, about the future of Eleanor's empire, and whether Mark truly belonged in that world. One evening, as they were having dinner at home, Eleanor seemed quieter than usual. Mark could tell something was on her mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the increasing tension from her family. "Eleanor," Mark said softly, reaching across the table. "I can feel it. The pressure from them. From your family. From everyone. I'm starting to wonder if this whole thing is just too much." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes tired, but still filled with determination. "I know," she said, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. "I feel it too. But Mark, this is bigger than just us. You're not just fighting for your future, you're fighting for mine as well. My family, my business, everything. They don't see what I see. They don't see how much you've helped me, how much you've made me rethink what's really important." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He had come into this arrangement thinking it was about survival, but now, he was realizing that it was about more than that. It was about the future, his future, Eleanor's future, and their future together. The pressure from her family was only going to grow, and the facade of their relationship would be harder to maintain as time went on. He knew that eventually, the truth would have to come out. Eleanor stood up, walking over to the window, her gaze distant. "I don't know how long we can keep pretending, Mark," she said quietly. "But I do know one thing. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I've seen what we could be together, and I can't ignore that." Mark stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Neither can I," he said, his voice full of conviction. They stood there in silence for a moment, both of them lost in thought, each grappling with the same question. What would their future look like? Could they continue living a lie, or was it time to face the truth and take the next step? Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked softly. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. For so long, he had been caught between the security of the arrangement and the desire for something real. But now, standing here with Eleanor, he knew what he wanted. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to be with you. I don't care about the empire, the family, or the business. I care about you." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. "Then let's stop pretending," she said, her voice full of resolve. In that moment, they both knew that they were ready to take the next step, whatever that might be. It was no longer about what they could gain from each other, it was about what they had already built together. The truth, whatever form it took, would have to come to light. But for now, they would face it together. As they stood there, hand in hand, Mark realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for. No more pretending. No more lies. It was time for them to write their own future, and whatever it looked like, they would face it together, as equals. The contract, the arrangement, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the truth. And that truth was enough. The next few days were a whirlwind. Mark and Eleanor knew they couldn't continue hiding in the shadows forever. It was time to face the truth, both about their relationship and the future they were building together. The pressure from Eleanor's family had been growing, but Mark could feel the shift in her. She wasn't the distant, calculating CEO anymore. She had opened herself up, and so had he. The facade of their business arrangement had finally crumbled, and now it was about something real, something they couldn't deny any longer. They decided to take the first step, to stop pretending, even if it meant facing the consequences head-on. One afternoon, Eleanor arranged a meeting with her family at the estate. Mark was nervous, his palms sweaty, but Eleanor squeezed his hand before they entered. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we face this together." The meeting was tense from the start. Eleanor's relatives had been expecting a certain level of formality, a display of control and perfection, but the air between them was different now. The distance that had once been there was gone, replaced with a quiet honesty that seemed to unsettle everyone in the room. Victoria, Eleanor's cousin, was the first to speak, her voice dripping with skepticism. "So, this is what it's come to, then?" she asked, glancing at Mark. "A business deal turned into a romance?" Mark felt the familiar weight of her judgment, but he held his ground. "It wasn't a business deal," he said firmly. "It was an agreement to start something that has become much more." Eleanor's eyes flickered with pride, and she turned to her family. "This isn't about what you think," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Mark and I have built something together, and it's real. We've been honest with each other, and that's more than I can say for many of you." The room was quiet. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The challenge had been laid down, and it was clear that Eleanor wasn't backing down. She had spent her life trying to please her family, but now, for the first time, she was speaking for herself. And she wasn't going to let anyone question what she had with Mark. Slowly, the tension began to fade. The room wasn't entirely warm, but the sharp edges of judgment were softened, if only just a little. Eleanor's parents, who had been silent up until now, exchanged a glance. Finally, her father, a quiet but imposing figure, spoke. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gruff, but with a hint of something softer behind it. "If this is what makes you happy, then we won't stand in your way." The relief that washed over Eleanor was palpable. It was clear that the battle wasn't fully over, but this was a victory. Mark looked at her, seeing a side of her he hadn't fully appreciated before, her strength, her courage, her willingness to fight for what she wanted. After the meeting, they left the estate together, their steps lighter than they had been in a long time. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, they felt like they were facing it on their own terms. Mark turned to Eleanor, his voice full of quiet certainty. "We're in this together," he said, his hand finding hers. Eleanor smiled, the weight of the world still there, but now shared between them. "Together," she agreed. The world outside may have been filled with uncertainties, but one thing was clear: they were no longer just two people caught in a deal. They had built something real, and no matter what happened next, they would face it together. And so, as they walked into the future, hand in hand, Mark knew that this wasn't just a business arrangement that had turned into a love story. It was a partnership built on trust, honesty, and a shared commitment to face whatever challenges came their way. Whatever came next, they were ready. Together.